Hello and welcome to another episode of Never Mind the Dambusters, the podcast which takes a deep dive into the rich, complex and often controversial history of RAF Bomber Command. Today I am joined, as usual, by my co-host Jane Gulliford-Lowes. How are you, Jane?
I'm very well, thank you. I'm working very, very hard at the minute, desperate for a holiday and some time off, but none in sight until Easter. And yeah, just looking forward to my visit to the International Bomber Command Centre on the 14th of March, where I'll be speaking at the Women in War conference. So that's going to be fun. So anyway, in this week's episode, we are joined by Marc Stevens, who's going to tell us the incredible story of his father, Squadron Leader Peter Stevens, MC. Peter Stevens was a Hamden pilot who was posted to 144 Squadron in 1941. However, Peter was not your conventional Bomber Command airman, as Marc will reveal. Welcome to the show, Marc. It's lovely to have you on board.
Thank you so much for the invitation, both of you, James and Jane.
Now, Marc, before we begin, you've just come back from an amazing trip, haven't you? Can you just tell us a little bit about where you've been and what you've been doing?
I have indeed. Thanks very much. Yeah, my wife was finally retired last year. And for the last, I'd say most of the last 12 months, probably 4 or 5 months, we've been away traveling and enjoying the sights all around the world. I think in the last 2 years, we've visited all 7 continents. So
Wow.
Our most recent adventure involved taking a cruise from San Diego through or via Hawaii, Tahiti, South Pacific Islands, including Fiji and Samoa and Tonga, and then all around New Zealand, finishing up in Australia. And then we spent a week in Australia before flying home a few days ago.
Wow. That is some trip. That is fantastic.
Rather envious, yeah. That sounds amazing. Gosh.
Well, this is what happens, A, when you get very old and have saved a lot of money, and B, have no children of your own.
Fair.
That's a fair point.
So, Marc, can you tell us a little bit about your background, about yourself, and what you knew about your father's RAF service when you were growing up?
Sure. My father emigrated to Canada from the UK 1952. He met and married my mother the following year, or met her in 52, married her in 53. My older brother was born in 54, and I came along in 57. We grew up between Montreal, Ottawa, and Toronto, but I've spent most of my life in Toronto, where I am now. Traveled around the world. Travel has been my bug, if you will. I think I'm up to something like 80 or 85 countries now. So growing up, my father was, I won't say an absentee father. I mean, he lived in our home until he died in 1979. He paid all the bills. He worked fairly hard. But there were a couple things I noticed about him. Number one, he had no family to speak of. We had met his little sister once, who lived in the UK, came over to visit us and spent maybe 3 days with us when I was very young. I think I was probably about 4 years old, and she took us to see the local circus. So, number one, my father had no family, or next to no family. I was not aware of any other relatives on his side of our family. Number two, he made no friends, which I found very sad. He died, as I said, in 1979 when he was 60. I was just 22, and I knew the bare bones basics about his life. I knew that he had joined the RAF, had become a bomber pilot, had flown several missions and had been shot down and captured, had spent over 3 years, almost 4 years as a prisoner of war, and supposedly had made a few escapes. I knew that he had some medals. I was able to look at them and play with them when I was quite young, but I didn't understand the significance of those medals. And about 8 years after my father died, so mid to late 80s, I got bitten by the bug. And I wanted to know specifically what he had done to receive these medals. And I figured, since one of them I had ascertained was the Military Cross, I didn't know exactly how rare that was for air crew. I now know that my father's is one of only 69 Military Crosses awarded to air crew in World War II. And that was an increased incentive for me to find out what in the world had he done to be one out of 69 people awarded this medal. So I determined there must be a piece of paper somewhere in the world that explained why or recommended why he should get that medal. And after my initial research, I discovered it would probably be found in the National Archives at Kew. And starting probably 88 or 89, I didn't find that piece of paper until 2006.
Oh, gosh.
But I
Wow.
finally did find it,
Wow.
along with a whole bunch of other stuff and many trips to Europe, traipsing around Europe, following in his footsteps, discovering his true background of having been born in Germany. And in 1996, which again is 17 years after his death, I finally tracked down his little sister, who was a spinster, still living in London in her late 70s. I picked up the phone and called her, introduced myself, and asked if she was indeed my aunt, because I wasn't sure if this was the right person. And she confirmed that she was. And I had already thought out what my question for her would be, because I'd heard several rumors that the family was actually Jewish and German. But her first question to me kind of shook me to the core, because I hadn't really thought it out. I hadn't anticipated what she would want to know from me. And her first question to me, of course, was, is my brother still alive? And it was very difficult for me to tell her that no, in fact, he had been dead for 17 years already by that point. So the good news was we were able to strike up a friendship, or rekindle a friendship, if you will. And I visited her a couple of times. She came over here once because my older brother had, in the interim period, met and married a Jewish American woman and had himself converted to Judaism. So that kind of brought the family full circle, if you will. And so my aunt was able to attend her great-nephew's bar mitzvah in Philadelphia.
Did your father ever mention anything about his war service, either to your mother, to your older brother, to you? Can you recall him ever discussing that?
Only the bare bones minimum, which I've already mentioned. The fact that he'd been a pilot, had been shot down and captured, and had made a couple of escapes. He really didn't talk about the war any more than that. And I learned subsequent to his death from my mother that he suffered from immense PTSD. He was unable to sleep. I guess he must have had horrible nightmares, because the night he was shot down, he was, I think it was his third combat operation, and it was his first time back to Berlin in the air. He'd been to Berlin many times on the ground, of course. And had, in fact, even attended the 1936 Olympic Games in Berlin, even though by then he was already living in London. He'd gone back for that summer.
Back.
At that point, he was 17 years old. He witnessed Jesse Owens winning a gold medal and Hitler refusing to present that gold medal to him. And the reason I know that is because we made a family trip to Berlin, 1967, when I was 10 years old. And my father quite proudly took us all over the city and showed us the Olympic Stadium and pointed to where he'd been sitting and where Hitler had been sitting and where he'd seen Jesse Owens win that gold medal.
Wow.
Did you know at that point in time that your father was German born? Did you know that he was German citizen? Or
I was told when I was a boy, but I was also told that this was a deep, dark family secret and that I was forbidden from mentioning it to a soul. And in fact, I don't know how old I was, maybe 8 when I found that out. The first person I told that secret to would have been, I was 39 years old and I was about to get married. It was to my future wife. So I literally never told a soul for over 30 years.
Gosh.
So it was considered a deep, dark family secret. I knew nothing about my father having been born Jewish. It turns out, I subsequently learned through my aunt, that when Hitler came to power in 32, 33, family began, first of all, my grandmother was a widow already. Her husband, my grandfather, had died in 1926, just when Hitler was starting to make noise down in Bavaria. The family, I should mention, was from Hanover and was quite well off. They were merchants. They owned many businesses. They owned a publishing business. My great-grandfather had started the local post office, for-profit post office in Hanover. And when Germany became a federated country in 1900, just 3 years after he had started that business, he was bought out. His business was nationalized to form part of the German post office. And so he was paid the sum of what today would be something like £3 million for his business by the government. So they were quite well off. They were merchants. I've traced the family tree as far back as I can because at some point they didn't even have family names. They just went by first names. So I've gone back about 200, 250 years, something like that. That's about as far back as I can go in Germany. Excuse me, always in the region of Hanover, which is in the northwest of Germany. Yeah, but again, my father never spoke about this. I had no knowledge of it. I had to glean this all myself. And I can't take all credit for it. At my aunt's funeral when she died in 2004, I met a second cousin who had done the family tree. He was also living in London. I think he'd been born in London. His father had emigrated to safety in the UK as well. And so he shared the family tree and all of the information he'd been able to put together over decades on the family's history. So I guess that makes me now, I thought I was the last living member of my family because my older brother died 10 years ago. I now know that I have about 6 or 7 cousins living in the United States who were all, I think their parents or grandparents were first or second cousins of my father. And they were able to get out to the UK as well. One of them as late as 38, I think, on the Kinder transport.
Wow.
I found out that shortly after Hitler came to power in January of 34, my father was sent to England by, again, his widowed mother. His older brother had preceded him to London. His brother, I think, was 4 or 5 years older than he was. So he was in his late teens. My father was 14 years old when he went to England. They were able to find a high school that would take him, even though his English skills were very limited, if not zero. And he completed his high school education. I have, in fact, his graduating report card from 1936 that gives him mostly very high marks, except in English. The teacher's comment was that he's very bright. It's just a shame that his poor English skills have hampered his results. After that, he attended the LSE, but just for a year. And I don't know why he dropped out of the LSE, whether it was a lack of funds, because, of course, the Nazis were making it next to impossible for German Jews to send money outside the country. They were stealing as much German Jewish wealth as they possibly could. So all of my grandmother's assets, whether financial or physical, were stolen over the course of the late 30s. The young sister, my aunt, had to go to finishing school in Switzerland. And when she graduated from there in 1938, she was then sent to England. So the 3 children were able to get out, or my grandmother was able to send them out to England, but was unable to leave herself. When the reason for that is not exactly clear. Whether she was unable to pay the exit tax, if you will, that Germany was charging Jews at that point, because it kept growing exponentially every year. We really don't know, and we'll never know, I don't think. So then my father got into a little bit of trouble with the law. What happened was, in England, my grandmother put together all of the liquid assets she could and sent that money. The sum was something like £5,000 or £6,000, which doesn't sound like a lot of money today, but in 1938, 39, that was a tremendous amount of money, and it would have been enough to support her 3 children in England for the entire 6-year duration of the war. Unfortunately, my father had a big grudge against his mother for what he believed was her abandonment of him. For example, I guess the biggest example of that would have been when his father died in 1926, and my father was only 6 years old at the time. His mother sent him away to boarding school in Bavaria, far other end of the country, and kept her other 2 children at home with her. And that scarred my father emotionally for life, unfortunately. From that point on, he hated his mother and would do anything he could to harm her. We all know that, of course, there must have been a good reason for this, and we'll never know what that reason was. Having said that, back to 1939, when she sent the money to England to look after her 3 children, My father immediately claimed all of it and proceeded to gamble it away deliberately in a fit of spite just to hurt his mother.
Gosh, that's so sad.
And then, yeah, I know it's a pitiful story. So it just goes to show you my father was not always the nicest man. He may have been incredibly brave, but he wasn't very nice at times. And I think maybe he came to understand his mother's actions later on in life, but I'm really not sure. So he was he had to resort to petty theft to survive after that. This we're talking about late 38, early 39, and I was able to locate a secret file at the National Archives, and the file belonged or originated from the Home Office. It was my father's emigration file and contained all of his records, including the criminal case against him. So I was only able to get my hands on that file, I think, in early 2007, if I'm not mistaken. And it showed his entire sordid past, if you will, of, for example, he took a job as a cashier in a convenience store, in a corner store, and stole a little bit of money out of the till. He took a job as a vacuum cleaner salesperson and pawned his sales sample. So this wasn't serious crime, obviously, but he was arrested and prosecuted and was given a sentence of 3 months in jail. And this all took place in the summer of 1939, I think July of 39. And of course, on September 1st, we all know what happened. The Nazis invaded Poland, sparking the outbreak of World War II. Excuse me. And on that same date, the Home Office issued a directive to all prison wardens saying, if you have anybody who's a nonviolent criminal with a short time left to serve on their sentence, let them out, because we will need the space in the prisons, because we will be soon interning any enemy aliens. One of whom, of course, was my father. And they knew him by his German name. He was still using his original identity. He had a German passport with a big red J stamped in it. And his birth name was Georg Hein. I was told that name, by the way, when my parents disclosed to me the fact that my father had been born in Germany. But the name really didn't mean anything to me. It's not like it was an obviously Jewish name. It wasn't. So that's why I never twigged the fact that he might have been Jewish. And I was told that the reason his grandmother had sent him to England in the 30s was simply because she didn't like political developments at the time in Germany, which in hindsight makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
So when my father was released from prison after having served 6 weeks of a 3-month sentence on September 1st, 39, he was given a train ticket to London and was told to report to a police station and was told that they would know what to do with him. And I think he must have thought that was pretty ominous sounding. And he didn't really want to spend the next 5 or 6 years in jail, as he had just spent the past 6 weeks. I don't think it was an enjoyable proposition for him. And so he decided he was going to do something just a little bit different. And while he had been at high school in London at the Regent Street Polytechnic, one of his schoolmates had died, and the entire school had attended the funeral. So he knew where that boy was buried. So he immediately took his train ticket to London, went to the cemetery, found that boy's gravestone, wrote down the details of his birth, took that information to the government registry office and applied to get a replacement copy of his birth certificate. And it just so happened that that boy's name, who had died, was Peter Stevens. So 2 days later, when Britain declares war on Germany in support of Poland, my father takes his birth certificate under the name Pete Stevens to an RAF enlistment station, plonks it down on the desk and says, "My name is Peter Stevens and I want to be a pilot." Now, of course, he was 20 years old. Like most young men of his era, I'm sure he wanted to be a Spitfire pilot.
Yeah.
I was later, because through the course of my 18 years of research, I was able to interview many, many people who had either flown with my father in combat, were prisoners of war with my father, and I even got to meet 2 people who had actually escaped with my father from prisoner of war camps.
Gosh.
Wow.
And that's a big part of the story. When I started making these discoveries and coming across these revelations, it egged me on to go as far as I possibly could with my inquiries. It became a real detective story, I think. And at one point, actually, when I discovered that my father had been born as a German Jew, I thought, oh crap, now I have to write a book about this. So what I found, to go on even further, is that of course he did enlist in the RAF. They chose to make him a bomber pilot rather than a fighter pilot. So he trained all through late 39. I guess that was just taken up with selection process to become a aircrew and pilot for pilot training, and went through subsequent levels of pilot training in 1940, and was fully qualified. Became a fully qualified Hampden pilot and joined this frontline squadron in April of 41. That was 144 Squadron. At the time, they were based in Hemswell in Lincolnshire. Partway through his tenure with the squadron, they moved down to North Luffenham, which is in Rutland, I think, or near Leicestershire. And so he flew various missions. On one of his later missions in August of 41, they had bombed, I believe it was Duisburg. It might have been one other target somewhere. It was an important military target. They were on their way back. Of course, this was the middle of the night. They didn't do any daylight bombing with Hamdens. Hamdens were incredibly badly armed from a defensive perspective, and they were getting shot down all over the place. So they only did nighttime bombing missions whenever possible, except at the very, very beginning of the war, and they suffered disastrous losses as a result. But they were somewhere over the continent at about 2 or 3 in the morning, pitch black, and they were attacked by 2 German night fighters who undoubtedly had been advised of their location by radar control from the ground. And one of the 2 night fighters, believed to be a Junkers Ju-88, hit them from stem to stern with heavy cannon fire. All 3 of my father's crewmen were injured during this attack. Fortunately, my father, who was the only one who had an armor-plated seat back, was not hit through the attack, and he, of course, immediately took evasive action and was able to get away from the first 2 attacks. And by sheer blind dumb luck, as they were in a vertical dive, one of the 2 rear gunners in the Hampden reached up to the trigger of his gun, pulled the trigger, and must have hit one of the Ju-88s in the fuel tank because he exploded in 1,000 pieces, according to his words. I was able to meet that. Both of those 2 rear gunners from that mission, they were both injured. One of them put out a fire in the back of the Hampden's fuselage using coffee in his thermos, if you can believe it. And that same fellow crawled forward through the tunnel under the pilot's seat to find out what had happened to the navigator bombardier, who was stationed in the nose of the Hampden at that point. And he was unconscious, but was bleeding quite profusely from a cannon shell injury in his leg. And so he was able to put a tourniquet on the wound, stabilize the patient, I guess, and give him some morphine, which they all carried. At that point, he went back to report to my father, who was unaware of any of this because the airplane had been so badly damaged, the intercom was even shot to bits and was not operative. So this fellow, whose name was John Matthews, reported to my father that the navigator was in bad shape, and should they consider dropping him out the escape hatch from the nose compartment and pulling his ripcord for him. And Dad decided that no, they didn't know where they were. He could have ended up in the middle of a forest somewhere, and nobody ever would have found him, and he certainly would have died. So Dad was able to finally get it back over the channel and headed straight for land as quickly as he could. But then he realized, of course, that the shortest possible course would have taken him back over the Thames estuary, and his own people would have shot him down. So he stayed out over the channel for a good hour before turning inland, before turning west, when he saw, I guess, what is known as the Wash. And the first base he found happened to be Coningsby. He had no business being there, but he knew it was an important air base. He didn't know which one it was at that point. He just put it down at 5 o'clock in the morning As he was making his final approach, realized he had neither flaps nor undercarriage available to him. They'd both been shot out, both hydraulics and pneumatic backup systems. And so he had to do a perfect belly landing in their field, in the middle of the field, which of course at that point was still grass in 41. And then he had to go and run and try and find somebody to come and help all of his injured crewmen. Luckily, after about 5 or 10 minutes of running around searching for someone, he was able to find a truck driver and co-opted him as an ambulance and took all 3 of his crewmen to the base medical facility. Luckily, they all survived, including the one with the cannon shell through his leg. And I was able to meet and interview 2 of those people. And in fact, they hadn't seen each other, hadn't spoken since the war.
Wow.
And I was able to put them back in contact with one another. And this would have been 89, I think. And they
wonderful.
were so very, very happy and so very, very grateful.
Can you tell us a little bit about the circumstances which led to your father being taken prisoner, Mark?
Sure. So after that very unfortunate evening, Dad was given a 2-week pass to go and steady his nerves, I guess. And when he came back to the squadron in early September, all of his 3 crewmen were still in hospital or were away on their own leaves recovering from their injuries. So he was given a brand new crew. And on September the 7th of 1941, he was detailed with the rest of the squadron to attack Berlin. And they made it there safely. It was, of course, the toughest, best defended target in all of the Third Reich. It was also a target that was at the extreme range of the Hamden. It could get there and back, but not quite with a full bomb load. So they had to short load the ordnance. They got to Berlin, they dropped their bombs, but almost immediately thereafter, they were hit by flak. The airplane rolled almost inverted. Dad was able to regain control of the airplane, and shortly thereafter was advised by his tail gunners that there was fuel leaking out of both wings, or there was liquid, which was obviously fuel leaking out of both wings. And that meant to Dad immediately that he knew there was no way possible for him to make it back to England. He also considered that the aircraft could explode at any moment. With high-octane fuel leaking from both wings, that was not a good scenario. And so he ordered his crew to bail out over the target. Sadly, 2 out of the 3 did. His new navigator bombardier had heard the story of what had happened to my father just 3 weeks earlier, and decided that he was going to stay with the airplane because he knew my father was a pretty good pilot and would keep him out of trouble. The other 2 tail gunners, the upper and lower tail gunner, both bailed out of the aircraft. And sadly, the lower tail gunner, who was a 19-year-old fellow, was never again seen alive. And I know that because in 1967, when my parents took us to Berlin, the first place we went was the Allied Forces Cemetery, and we were looking for his grave. And sadly, body was never identified, and he has no known grave. And that was the second and final time in my life that I ever saw my father cry.
Gosh.
And
wow.
You might find it interesting, the first time I saw my father cry was just 2 years before that, watching Winston Churchill's funeral on television.
Good grief. Wow.
Sorry, I get a little bit choked up when I talk about it.
Don't blame me, no?
Yeah.
It's a little bit emotional for me. Anyway, ever since I'd started investigating my father's story, I had always been trying to track down the family of that 19-year-old tail gunner, because I knew my father had felt incredibly, terribly guilty over his death. And amazingly, in 2013, I got an email out of the blue from a woman who was that young man's niece.
Wow.
And I had to explain to her exactly what had happened to him, because her family had never been told. They'd never had any details of his disappearance, if you will. They were advised that he was missing in combat, and then eventually, months later, they said they were told, presumed dead. Of course, my father, after these 2 bailed out, and he turned westward to try and get as far away from Germany as he possibly could. But he knew he would run out of fuel eventually, and he did run out of fuel on his first engine somewhere over eastern Holland. Kept going and as far as he could, and then he realized he had only about 10 minutes fuel left on his good engine. decided to put it down in a farmer's field just north of Amsterdam. He did so, and then he and his navigator destroyed all the secret bits and set fire to the fuselage. They went on this was still at like 4 a.m, so it was still quite dark. They went on the run. They knocked on the front door of a Dutch farmer's house to see if he could get help and be put in contact with the Dutch resistance. But the farmer was scared to death and was terribly worried that German troops would kill him and his family, and told my father he couldn't hide them, but he would do his best to contact the resistance, and that my father should come back the following evening. So Dad and his navigator went on the run. They broke into a sports clubhouse and hid for the duration of that day. But towards the end of that afternoon, they heard a dog barking, and they heard German troops approaching, and the dogs gave away their position, obviously, and they were told to come out with their hands up, and they did. So at that point, it was, again, September 8th of 41. So that began a period of 3 years and 8 months for my father as a POW, not only in his own country, but without any protection whatsoever under the Geneva Convention, because, of course, he was still a German citizen. He had no nationalization papers. He had no citizenship rights whatsoever with the UK. So, in effect, he was a traitor fighting against Germany, even though he was Jewish. Now, fortunately, his British identity, his stolen British identity, kept him safe because his captors were never able to discover his true identity. At this point, he realized that he wanted to escape, number one. Number two, he would have an immense and enormous advantage over most escapers because A, he was German, B, he spoke the language perfectly, C, he knew how Germans acted and behaved and lived and worked. He knew all of their customs. He knew the geography of the country quite well. So he had a huge advantage, and he began escaping almost immediately. On his very first escape, which was maybe a month after he was shot down and captured, he jumped off a moving prison train. He was being transferred from one prison camp to another, along with 1,000 other POWs in cattle cars, locked in cattle cars, with armed German guards on board the train. My father and a Canadian pilot unscrewed the ventilator cover off an opening in the side of the cattle car and jumped out while the train was in motion. Unfortunately, somebody else tried exactly the same thing at the same time and landed on the emergency air hose coupling between two cattle cars and applying automatically the emergency brakes. So the German guards, wondering what was happening, opened their doors, looked out, and what do they see but my father and this Canadian pilot making a run for it. So they started taking target practice. This Canadian pilot, I got to know quite well after my father died. His name was Mike Lewis. He ended up telling me all the stories about that particular escape, where they hid out by day. They traveled on freight trains. They jumped freight trains like hobos did, and made their way to my grandmother's home in Hanover, because they were still walking around downtown Hanover in broad daylight wearing their Air Force uniforms, if you can believe it. All they did was take off their battle dress jackets and their sweaters and put the battle dress jacket back on and the sweater over top. So it wasn't super obvious, but they were both young men in their 20s. And I guess that would have looked pretty suspicious, but amazingly, they got away with it. They were able to get to my grandmother's home and knocked on the door, and a strange woman answered that nobody recognized. And my father asked to speak with Mrs. Hine, not saying my mother. I'm here, I'm visiting. I wanted to say hello to Mrs. Hine. She's a family friend, and was told by the woman who answered the door, I'm sorry, you didn't know she had committed suicide 2 years ago.
Oh my God, that's awful.
So you can imagine that that would have come as a complete shock to my father. She had been able to get her 3 children to safety, but had not been able to get out herself. And she had an idea what was in the future and the cards for her going forward, and didn't want any part of it. So I still consider her today. And when I talk about her, I say she is the bravest woman I ever knew.
What a set of choices to have to make. Yeah, it's unimaginable.
The story just gets more and more incredible. After that, my father said, okay, well, we'll go and visit an aunt and uncle who live nearby. And they were able to give them civilian clothing, money, and food. And of course, the aunt and uncle were later deported and murdered in the concentration camps. And I now know, having continued my work on the family tree, the number got so big I had to start keeping a spreadsheet. And I now know that or at least the number I have today of Holocaust murder victims in my father's family is up to 65. Now, that includes third cousins, fourth cousins, but that's just one family.
Sure.
These are people I never knew, names I didn't recognize, names my father never mentioned. But there are some family names that will be familiar to people, like Oppenheimer and Rothschild in the family tree. So nobody was immune. They took everyone. And these were, of course, the older generation. These are the people who decided nothing will ever happen to me. I'm too old to be a threat to them.
Yeah,
they won't bother. So after getting help from the aunt and uncle, Mike Lewis and my dad, they took the smart route. They decided they were going to go and try and head south to Switzerland, and took the slow trains. They took the what we call the milk run trains that made stops at every little village, rather than the express trains, because they knew the Gestapo were hanging out on the express trains doing identity checks. Of course, having jumped off a train only a month after they'd been shot down, they had no false identity papers. They had very little other than what they'd been able to acquire from a dad's aunt and uncle in the way of civilian clothing and a little bit of money and food. And they got as far as Frankfurt that night, but the train stopped running overnight because that's when the bombing happened. And so they had to find a place to sleep until they could get to the next train heading south towards the Swiss border the next morning. So they saw a bunch of people sleeping in the station waiting room and decided that looked pretty safe. So they did so, but they didn't realize that there would be a railway identity paper check in the middle of the night. And so they were caught up in that and had to get themselves back up. So they were taken back to POW camps. And that was because that was my father's first escape. He was already something of a celebrity, if you will, amongst the other POWs. Dad went to the escape committee and explained to them that he spoke perfect German, and they offered him the opportunity. He wanted to escape again. He wanted to try it again. They offered him the opportunity to put together a group of 10 prisoners who were willing to take part in a group escape. They gave my father a fake German uniform and carved him a block of wood that looked like a German rifle. And they gave him one other person who was willing to get dressed up as a guard. And they literally marched a group of 10 prisoners right out the front gate of the camp.
Wow.
Dad was able to talk his way out of the camp. Now, he only got about 100 or 200 meters away, and then the gate guard who had let him out blew his whistle, got his attention, and waved at him to come back. Now, of course, Dad was a pretty bright individual, and he thought, I've got a block of wood. He's got a real rifle that has bullets in it. This might not be a smart thing if I don't do what he's asking me to do. He didn't know what the problem was, but he figured he'd turn around and go back and find out. He didn't think he was in any trouble at that point because there were no alarms. There was no yelling or screaming. It was just, hey, come back. So he turned the group around, went back to see what the problem was. And the gate guard took him aside and quietly explained to him that the pass he had given him to allow the group to get out of the camp gate was missing the signature of the officer of the day. And this gate guard could get in trouble if he handed this pass in without that signature. So would my father mind please going back into the camp, getting the pass signed, and then he could come back out again? My father turned the party around and went right back into the camp, saying, sure, no problem. But they didn't know who the officer of the day was that day, so they couldn't even forge a signature. So they all dissipated and went back to their barracks. Dad got out of his German uniform and debriefed with the escape committee. And they all decided together that this had come so close to fruition that they had to try it again. And so 2 weeks later, when there was a different gate guard on duty, they tried it again. And unfortunately, he was suspicious right away. And so when my father presented himself at the gate the second time, 2 weeks later, he was immediately asked for his pay book to prove his identity because the guard was suspicious immediately. And my father said to him, well, look, do you carry your pay book everywhere you go? Mine's back in the barracks. I don't care. I don't walk around with my pay book all day long. Why would you want that? And they were having this discussion. And in the meantime, the group of 10 prisoners was getting a little bit nervous, shall we say, because this was going on too long. Excuse me. And so a couple of them just decided to wander back into the camp. They were getting a little too worried about what was happening. And finally, they all decided to disperse in different directions. And seeing this, the real guard started screaming at my father. He said, what are you doing? Don't just stand there. Go and arrest them. In other words, he had no clue that my father was fake.
Wow.
That's crazy. So can you tell us a little bit about how your father's war sort of ended and where he was and what he was doing, what camps he was in the later stages of the war, and also a little bit about his post-war career, because that's very interesting as well, isn't it?
Sure, I'd be happy to. He was transferred from there to O-Flag 21B at Shubin. And in fact, today, March the 5th, 2025, is the 82nd anniversary of a mass escape from Shubin in which he took part. 33 men got out of a tunnel dug under a cesspit, if you can believe this, in the officer's latrine. He was number 21 out of the tunnel with Wings Day, and Jimmy James went out that tunnel, Tommy Kalman, a bunch of really big name escapers. Was eventually recaptured by the Gestapo. This was in 43. And fortunately, after 3 or 4 days in the company of the Gestapo, which were rather unpleasant, I gather, the Luftwaffe came calling, looking for him because, of course, Goering's orders had been that the Luftwaffe took care of aircrew prisoners, and the Gestapo was forced to give him back. From there, he was sent to Stalag Luft 3, the original compound, the East Compound, where he was immediately named upon his arrival as head of contacts for the X organization. And that was the code word, if you will, for the head scrounger in East Compound. So I'm sure you're familiar with the movie The Great Escape.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
James Garner played the head scrounger in North Compound for The Great Escape. A lot of the characters in the movie The Great Escape were, in fact, composites of 2 or 3 or 4 real people. What you remember seeing in The Great Escape movie being done by James Garner was, in fact, exactly the type of work that my father did for the X organization in East Compound. And I have the camp official history that I picked up in the National Archives that names him as the head of contacts for X in East Compound. Fortunately for him, he was in East and was never transferred to North, because had he gone to North, he would have been involved in the Great Escape. He would have been one of the lowest numbers to leave the tunnel because, of course, he spoke perfect German. And undoubtedly, as a serial escaper, as an unmarried serial escaper, the likelihood would have been that he would have been recaptured, because 73 of the 76 were recaptured. And we all know that 50 of the 73 were murdered. So at the end of the war, when the Russians were approaching, first of all, he was involved, of course, in the Long March.
Yeah.
With the evacuation westward from Stalag Luft 3, in the worst winter on record in Eastern Europe in something like 100 years. They were evacuated at the end of January 45 through the worst blizzard you'd ever seen. He eventually made it back, I think, after 10 or 15 days to a camp called Stalag 3A, which was located at Luckenwald, just south of Berlin, which was a hellhole because there was absolutely no food. Dad had already lost 20 pounds in the 3 years and 4 months of captivity. And in the last 3 months of the war, when there was no food at all, he lost another 20 or 30 pounds. So he probably weighed about 110 pounds by the time he was liberated.
Gosh.
At the end of April 1945. Of course, it took time for him to be repatriated. It took a lot of time for him to regain his health and his regular body weight. He stayed in the Air Force for a couple of years and was posted to Berlin as the ADC to an Air Vice Marshal with the occupation troops. He became his personal translator and personal pilot, and that was Air Vice Marshal Davidson. In 1946, Dad was awarded the Military Cross when all of his escape activities came to light. And then shortly thereafter, his exploits came to the attention of a little organization we know today as MI6. And they offered him a job in 1947. So
Gosh,
he thought that
it's just
sounded a little more interesting than what he was doing in the RAF at the time, by which time he'd been promoted squadron leader. And so he went off on another adventure and spent the next 5 years from 1947 to 52 spying against the Soviets in East Germany.
You literally could not make up this story. It's just insane.
You couldn't make it up. And the funny thing is I wrote letters all over to everybody trying to obtain records of his service. And the Air Force was quite willing to part with that information. I had to file a Freedom of Information Act application to get his secret home office file opened early because it said secret sealed until the year 2051. I got it opened in late 2006 because I could prove that he was dead. I told him, I think I know what's in here. I think there's a little bit of criminal history, but it's nothing earth-shattering, and I'm willing to have that made public. So after a couple of months of them looking at it, they came back to me and said, okay, the file is open. Anyway, Dad, the really ironic part of the whole story, at the ending of my dad's story, is he was very smart, very ambitious. Based on interviews with people I knew who worked with him in MI6 at the time, who I was able to track down as family friends, he wanted to move up the ladder in MI6. And he was barred from doing so only on the basis of one thing. And this is the greatest irony I've ever heard. He didn't have an Oxbridge degree on his CV.
Sounds
now,
about right.
If you know anything about that era in MI6, you would have heard of the Cambridge spies.
Oh, yeah.
Philby and McLean and Blunt and Burgess, who were all Soviet moles who joined MI6 and had met at Cambridge, and they just about destroyed MI6 from the inside out. So I just find it hilariously sad that my father was denied the opportunity to serve the country that saved him from the Nazis, or allowed him to save himself from the Nazis, only on the basis that he hadn't been to Oxford or Cambridge.
That's so sad, isn't it?
Anyway, make a long story short, that's when he emigrated to Canada in 1952 and made a career in industry, mostly as a trade association executive, and then died of a heart attack brought on by chemotherapy in 1979.
Gosh,
Wow.
what a
And the
life.
story was untold.
Yeah.
And this is all in a book now as well.
It's in a book that I wrote that was published in the UK by Pen and Sword in 2009, and the book is entitled Escape, Evasion, and Revenge. And I'm very pleased to say that in 2021, the Guardian newspaper published their list of the top 10 books about revenge, I believe, ever written. And number one, they put as The Count of Monte Cristo. I think number two might have been Hamlet, and a couple of others in there. And number 8 was the Bible. They put my book at number 5.
Wow.
That's good going, isn't it? Wow, you're in some fine company. Yeah.
Yes.
Some very fine company there. James, do you want to do the wrap up now, because we're coming to the end of our time?
Yeah, I just thank you so much for that. I'm a little bit dumbstruck with that. What an absolutely incredible story. And yeah, it's just, and anybody, please, go and read the book. You want to know more? I know I certainly do now. So just really a massive thank you, Mark, for coming on and sharing that. It's just wonderful.
Always my pleasure. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Yeah, we'll include a link in the show notes for the book. So yeah, if to our listeners, if you have enjoyed this show, I would love you to leave a review or star rating on your favourite podcast platform. It's a huge help in connecting us with other like-minded history enthusiasts. If you want early access to episodes, live streams and exclusive Q&A sessions, you can support the show for just £2.40 or $3 a month. Simply follow the link in the show notes or visit nevermindthedambusters.buzzsprout.com. You can join the conversation in our Facebook discussion group and follow us on social media as well. If you'd like to reach out, just send a message to us at the top of the show notes.
Well, thanks for listening, everybody. I'm just completely blown away by that story. I really am. I'm struggling to take it all in. There's just so much. Each one of those chapters alone would be like a fantastic story in itself, but also ultimately so tragic and so sad. Just thank you so much for sharing that with us, Mark. It was absolutely wonderful. So thank you for listening, everybody, and we'll see you all again at the same time next week. Thanks. Bye.